the Falkland Islands, famous for a key naval battle during World War I, penguins, and being the site of what is oft referred to as the last Colonial War. What a dreadful oversimplification that is. Outside of the war that captured the world's attention for 10 weeks in 1982, the Falklands and its story is rich in nuance and connections to other, much wider patterns in history. To understand the Falklands War, we have to look back in time to the circumstances in which the islands became Britain's further-flung outpost. It's a fascinating story in and of itself. The very first consideration of the Falklands in history, though only in a theoretical sense, is in the papal bull issued by Pope Alexander VI in 1492. This split the world outside Europe between Spain and Portugal along a meridian line partway between the Portuguese Cape Verde Islands and the Spanish-claimed Hispaniola, modern-day Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, essentially granting the Indian Ocean to Portugal and the Atlantic to Spain. To this day, for want of any actual credible arguments, Argentine revisionists will point to this document as proof of their right to the Falklands. However, a papal bull was not, as is sometimes claimed, the equivalent of international law at the time. The 1494 treaty was little more than an agreement of spheres of influence between Spain and Portugal, and was not signed and thus ignored by other powers. There was not even unity among the Catholic monarchs, as it was not supported by Francois I of France. This cannot be said to hold equivalency to modern organizations, such as the United Nations. Indeed, subsequent bulls issued by other wearers of the mightiest hat in Rome contradicted the one of 1492, based on the relative favor of Spain and Portugal in the Vatican. This says nothing of the questionable motives of Pope Alexander, known to history as the Borgia Pope, father of Cesare and Lucrezia and that infamous dynasty, or the fact that Spain did not universally seek to enforce the bull as made quote-unquote legal by the Treaty of Tordesillas, such as when Portugal began its expansion in Brazil over the agreed meridian line at 47 degrees west. Add to this that the treaty is the very basis of the evil of European colonialism in the Americas, and that it ignores two universal legal principles. Nemo dat quod non habet. No one may give what he does not possess. Pacta tertius nec nocent nec prosunt. Pacts neither harm nor benefit third parties. And we see how truly ridiculous it is to hold up such a document as any sort of justification. The beginning of the 16th century provides us with multiple explorers in the region whose tales are connected to the Falklands. There is no evidence to support claims that the Falklands were discovered by either Vespucci or Magellan before 1520. First recorded map reference of the islands, a map produced in 1522 by Portuguese cartographer Pedro Reinel, was later copied and sold to the French friar André the Vet, and is now held in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. In 1540, a ship out of Seville, its name lost to history, harbored in the Falklands, one of the crew recording that
All this country is bare with not a bit of good. Very windy and very cold, because 8 months in the year it snows and the prevailing winds are southwest.
In August 1592 we have the first written recorded sighting of the islands by John Davis aboard the Desire. A passenger with Davis noted of Falklands,
The 14th we were driven in among certain isles, never before discovered, lying 50 leagues or better from the shore, in which place, unless it had pleased God of his wonderful mercy to have ceased the wind, we must of necessity have perished.
Around this time, having purchased the galleon Dainty that was built for his father, Richard Hawkins sets out for the Spanish Main. Depending on who you believe, he was either set on a journey of exploration or of plunder, the two quite often being one and the same in the high times of privateering, buccaneering, and other piratical activities ending in earing. Hawkins was blown east from the strait and found himself on an archipelago he named Hawkins' Maiden Land, as was the style at the time. As well as the purpose of his voyage, it is disputed whether these islands Hawkins named were the Falklands at all. Some scholarly debate among age of exploration academics exists as to this, and it is believed Hawkins may, in fact, have been on a different archipelago. In any event, he cannot be entirely blamed for inaccuracy of recollection. Defeated in battle a few months later at San Mateo Bay, Hawkins spent many years in Spanish prisons before he was able to publish the account of his voyage. Hawkins went home to a knighthood, mayorship of Plymouth, and a seat in Parliament. In the year 1600, the Dutch explorer Sebald de Weert discovered the northwestern arm of the Falklands, naming them after himself, the Sebaldis. The ship's surgeon reported that on these three hitherto unmapped islands they found a great number of penguins, but little else to draw attention. These islands will later become the Jason Islands and are recognized as part of the wider Falklands group. Worth mentioning at this point is the Anglo-Spanish War of the 17th century. The Treaty of Madrid in 1670 essentially confirmed the British squat on Jamaica, again Spain having to adjust its possession under the Treaty of Tordesillas to hard reality. There was no mention specifically of the South Atlantic, an area Spain showed little interest in at the time, and Britain had already established itself in the South Atlantic on St. Helena 10 years before the treaty was signed. For a time the Falklands are left untouched and unbothered, there being far more lucrative colonial dreams to be dreamed by the great powers. Britain will be first to return to the islands near the end of the 17th century. In 1690, Captain John Strong with his ship, the Welfare, lands on West Falkland at Bold Cove, near what will become Port Howard. Strong noted in his journal that
Wednesday this morning we weighed and stood unto an harbour on ye west side, and there came to an anchor, and sent our boat on shore for fresh water, and did kill abundance of geese and ducks, but as far as wood there is none.
a settlement remains there to this day, and we will revisit it later to tell the tale of a few SAS lads during the war. Strong names the sound running between the East and West Islands, the Falkland Sound, after Anthony Carey, who has sponsored his voyage and was the 5th Viscount Falkland. This is the first of many connections between the Falklands and Scotland that we will see. The name of the Falkland peerage comes from the royal burgh of the same name in the Scottish region of Fife. Strong was the first to note the native foxes of the island, which he named the Warra. In 1701, the French explorer Jacques de Beauchez added the final piece of the Falklands archipelago to the map with the discovery of Buchan Island, which sits far to the south of the landmass that will later be named Lafonia. Note that on this map, both Buchan and the Sebaldis are drawn much further west than they really are. In 1708, the first use of Falklands land to refer to the entire archipelago is made by British privateer Wood Rogers when he too explored the islands. Rogers went on to be the first British governor of the Bahamas, and it was his ship that rescued the marooned Alexander Selkirk who inspired the tale of Robinson Crusoe. Another name is added to the gathering confusion of nomenclature in 1716, when the French mapmaker Amédée François Fraser christened them Les Isles Nouvelles. This name exists in Argentine port records as the name for the islands until at least the 1820s. The French geographer royal in the early 1720s, Guillaume de Lille, renamed them Les Isles Malouines, after the Brittany port of St. Malo, from which French ships visiting the islands had departed. Is this name that will become Islas Malvinas in modern Argentine language? To look for a moment at the backdrop to all this, it is worth pointing out that for the first decade of the 18th century, Europe was riven once again with a continental war. The wars of Spanish succession between the Habsburg and Bourbon claimants to the Spanish throne and its imperial possessions, in some respects a proxy war between Protestantism and Catholicism, were finally resolved in the various treaties around 1713, one of which being the Treaty of Utrecht. Specifically, it refers to territories already possessed by Spain and the restoration of these lands to their state at the death of Carlos II. This cannot be said to include the Falklands, which were still more than 50 years away from any kind of permanent human occupation. It is worth noting here that the various viceroyalties of Spanish South America did not yet extend into the far south of Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego, these lands still being held by the native people. There was, however, still no immediate interest in the Falklands by any of the imperial powers. While small conflicts occurred between Britain, Spain, and France in the period between then and the 1760s, these were more like imperial business as usual, not truly global and regime-changing wars. Lord Anson, during the War of Jenkins' Ear, another war over the colonial mastery of North America, briefly visited the Falklands while on a privateering circumnavigation of the globe and said that such islands would,
in time of peace, be of great consequence, and in times of war make us masters of the sea.
But his vision was not followed up by the British. This would change in the aftermath of the next global conflict, the 7 Years' War, fought between 1756 and 63. This war pitted the now united houses of Habsburg and Bourbon, France, Spain, and Austria, against Britain, Prussia, and other German states in conflicts from the Americas to Asia. Britain emerged on the side of the victors and consolidated their position in the Americas, continuing the process of expulsions of French settlers from Canada. Quebec, the cherished crown jewel of New France, changed hands to Britain as of the 1763 Treaty of Paris. With the mainland Americas exhausted by the war, it was not a feasible time for any imperial power to extend. Now was a time for consolidation. France then felt confident enough, almost certainly hurting from the loss of their North American territory, to send an expedition to claim a fresh stake for France overseas. For this, they chose the Falklands. Like the earlier French ships that mapped the islands, this expedition followed tradition in leaving from St. Malo. They were led by Louis-Antoine de Bouganville, who has eschewed a career in law to join the French army, and had fought gallantly in the ultimately doomed French defense of Quebec in 1759. Serving further at the battles around Montreal, he ended the war as a diplomat and worked on the aforementioned Treaty of Paris. Bougainville and his mainly Acadian settlers, those who had refused to sign oaths of loyalty to Britain, set out on the Eagle and the Sphinx for the Falklands in September 1763, entirely at Bougainville's own expense. They arrived early the next year at French Bay, now Berkeley Sound, where Bougainville noted that it was
a countryside lifeless for want of inhabitants. Everywhere a weird and melancholy uniformity.
Still, beggars can't be choosers, so a colony they duly established. Bougainville also notes in his journal the source of a mystery in earlier sightings by the likes of Rogers, which held there were forests on the island. These sightings by earlier explorers had in fact been a particular type of rushes colored and stood together to appear like trees from a distance. Bougainville held a formal ceremony on 5th April the following year and departed again for France, leaving the settlers to their business. One can imagine the pride Bougainville would have felt at restoring some modicum of honor to the notion of a French America, even if it were only a minor outpost. His personal war with Britain would come again, as Bougainville commanded ships in several actions during the American Revolutionary War, and lived long enough to be made a senator during the First French Empire. The next of our dramatis personae to visit the islands is one John Byron, known to history as Foul-Weather Jack, whose grandsons would later include the poet Lord Byron. He had sailed with Lord Anson when he made his observations about the Falklands aboard the HMS Wager, ending it shipwrecked on the Chilean coast and eventually finding his way back to England via a brief time in Spanish captivity. Like de Bougainville, Byron fought in the 7 Years' War. Byron was active in naval battles around French America after the British captures of Quebec and Montreal that his French contemporary had fought in, though they were not present in Canada at the same time. Seeking to establish a South American naval station in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, Byron was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the East Indies Fleet to act as cover for him leaving England in June 1764, for South America to scout out a potential location with the 24-gun frigate Dolphin and the 16-gun sloop Timar, later also acquiring the supply ship HMS Florida when stopping at Port Desire, now in modern-day Argentina. Byron was acting on the estimates of Anson in looking for one of two suitable locations, the first being the Falklands and the second being Pepys Island. Pepys is now believed to be a mythical place, a phantom island or another island misidentified, most likely the Sibaldies. Byron arrived in early 1765 and established Port Egmont on Possession Island, which is shortly to be renamed Saunders Island. Byron said of his entry into the natural port that the answer to their quest was beyond all expectations. Byron noted in his journal that,
"If you choose to go into Port Egmont, I think it, without exception, one of the finest harbours I ever saw in my life."
The British made their claim legitimate by the means of working the land. A watering place was dug, and the surgeon of the Tamar planted a small vegetable garden. A small gesture, but enough to qualify legally as having performed some works of settlement. Unaware of the French settlement on East Falkland, Byron left again. Bouganville would later write that it was not before 1766 that the English established their presence, but he was not present on the islands after April 1764. So in this writing he would have been referring to the next British jaunt to the Falklands, that of the Scottish captain John MacBride. In February 1766, MacBride and his 3 ships, the Jason, the Carcass, a bomb ketch on which a young Horatio Nelson would later serve, and the Experiment, arrived at Byron's landing site, having mapped the Jason Islands, those also known as the Sibaldines. MacBride established Fort George and the attendant settlement of Jason's town, and in December that year first encountered the French settlement. There was a mild argument about who should quit the island between MacBride and the French governor, with no real outcome. MacBride's left leaving one ship, the Favorite, at the settlement to develop it further. Whatever words were exchanged would have been for naught anyway, for the French and Spanish governments had already negotiated the handover of the colony to Spain. Ordered by the French to sell the colony, de Bougainville had done his best to plead with the court in Madrid to relent, but these pleas fell on deaf ears. He would be denied again later in life, when, as a senator under Napoleon, he suggested that a handing back of the islands to France should be a condition in the Peace of Amiens that ended the French Revolutionary Wars. Port Louis was renamed Puerto Soledad and was officially handed over on 1st April 1767 from Bougainville to the first Spanish governor, Felipe Ruiz Puente. This will become one of the many sacred dates in Argentine Falklands mythos, and will be the very day Argentina initiates Operation Rosario in 1982. As was standard policy at the time for imperial powers and their far-flung island colonies, as continues to this day in forms such as Guantanamo Bay, Puerto Soledad was to become a penal colony. In the days before modern security systems, one of the surest methods to keep convicts contained was to simply place them somewhere from which there would be no feasible means of escape. The feral cattle introduced by the French provided food and income for the island, so much so that the Spanish bullfighting tradition was alive and well among the population. At the same time, ships of other nations continued to use the Falklands as a stopover, mainly sealers and whalers, with no major interference from Spain. 2 years later, in November 1769, Spanish ships surveying the islands exchanged letters with Captain Hunt on Saunders Island, accusing each other of unlawful conduct, which finally brought the British station to the forefront of the Spanish crown's attention. Furious at what they saw as the breaking of the Utrecht Treaty, war was threatened by Spain against Britain for the insult. The Spanish Viceroyalty performed a recce of the site in early 1770, and then in June sent a squadron of 5 ships under General de Madariaga from Buenos Aires to expel the British. Vastly outnumbered, there was a token exchange of shots from the fort's battery of 12-pounder cannon before the commanders, Matby and Hunt, sued for terms. Held in captivity for 20 days, they were permitted to return to England aboard the Favorite, with their settlement now rechristened as Cruzada. There is still debate over where the order to forcibly eject the British came from Spain, or was the Viceroyalty acting on their own initiative. The Spanish Crown representatives would officially claim the king had not ordered the seizure, and that the governor in Buenos Aires was simply acting within his general orders of preserving Spanish sovereignty. The British government reacted furiously, demanding the repatriation of their people and restitution for seized stores. According to a telling of events at the time, the handover was excessively polite on the part of the Spanish general, other than the firing of warning shots from their ships and the token volley of Hunt's battery. However, as later in the 1977 crisis, and on the opening of the 1982 war, Britain responds immediately to protect her interests. A squadron of warships is assembled from Plymouth and other ports and sets sail for the Falklands. Spanish attempts to turn the discussion into one of rights of sovereignty fell on deaf ears until the insult was redressed.
By God, sir, I will not stand for this! I shall have recompense!
Without the backing of France over the issue, Spain had to allow the restoration of the British presence. As we will see happens again in the Falklands history, an uneasy agreement is made that does not really satisfy either side, but merely kicks the can down the road to a later date. The wording of the treaty favors neither Britain nor Spain's exclusive rights to the islands. Specifically, the agreement states
that the engagement of his said Catholic Majesty to restore to his Britannic Majesty the possession of the port and fort called Egmont cannot nor ought in any wise to affect the question of the prior right of sovereignty of the Malouine Islands, otherwise called Falklands Islands.
It is a common myth that a secret agreement was made alongside this, that there was an understanding the British would leave again, the restoration of the fort simply being a symbolic gesture to restore the king's honors.
It's a common misconception held by all truly stupid people.
This was certainly discussed at the negotiations, alongside the idea that both sides would quit the islands entirely, but it was never agreed in the treaty nor said with the weight of a ministerial promise. A little tangential factoid here is the involvement of Dr. Samuel Johnson in the British side of the first Falklands crisis. Writing a pamphlet to quell the mob's imperial bloodlust and discredit the value of the islands, he described it as
thrown aside from human use, stormy in winter and barren in summer.
Its garrison would envy the exiles of Siberia, and prophetically,
such a force would be a perpetual expense to Britain.
In April 1771, John Stott arrives to re-establish the fort and town with the ships Juno, Hound, and Florida, with the formal handover completed by September. Again, there seems to be some conflict in sources as to how long exactly the British maintained a presence here. The garrison was withdrawn in 1774 as Britain sought to reduce its overseas commitments with trouble brewing in the 13 colonies. In one of life's little ironies, it was the earlier British success during the first Falklands crisis that had helped cause overconfidence on the American front, in that Britain felt fairly safe against French intervention after their decision not to back Spain in 1770. There is some suggestion this was a partial withdrawal and that there was still some presence, possibly settlers in Jamestown without a military presence in the fort, until 1776, but it is clear by this date the British had pulled out of West Falkland. The British will assert that the flag still flew as they left and that therefore it did not constitute a permanent abandonment. The departing governor, Samuel Clayton, left a plaque in 1774 that read,
"Be it known to all nations that Falklands Island with this fort, the storehouses and wharves, are the sole right and property of His Most Sacred Majesty, George III, King of Britain."
While this was happening, there was some minor activity elsewhere in these waters. In 1775, James Cook discovered South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands, claiming these for Britain. As these islands are really just overgrown static icebergs, they were not feasible for settlement, so Cook sailed on, but these islands will become important much later in our story. The settlement of Grytviken, established in the early 20th century on South Georgia by Norwegian whalers, will in 1982 be the final site of British resistance to the opening invasion by a hardy band of Royal Marines. The British settlement on West Falkland was used for a time after their formal departure by sealers operating in the area, until shortly after the outbreak of war, yet again between Britain and Spain in 1779, due to Spanish support of the foundling United States through the Bourbon family compact. This war also featured the famous Great Siege of Gibraltar, where for 3.5 years a British Hanoverian force, outnumbered nearly 10-1, held off a Franco-Spanish siege. The following year, Spanish forces razed the British settlement. By 1781, their own colony on East Falkland now numbered some 100 souls, mostly convicts and their military guards, with a score or so of buildings making up the settlement. The Anglo-Spanish War ended in 1786, but Britain and Spain would lock horns once again before the end of the century. The Nootka crisis was triggered when British ships seeking to establish a fur trading colony on the Canadian Pacific coast were seized and their crews arrested by the Spanish. With increasing unrest across their empire, Spain had been fortifying and exploring this area intensely in order to establish prior discovery claims and monitor British, American, and Russian encroachment. Much like the earlier Falklands crisis, Spain began flexing its muscles but had to accept a diplomatic solution when her French ally was not prepared to go to war against the British and Dutch. Britain won out once more in the settlement, now having rights to establish outposts in what is now British Columbia, ending Spain's dominance of these trade routes from the Pacific coast to the Asian continent. While this has little to do with the Falklands specifically, that is exactly the point. This is another treaty that will be cited by Argentina later that contains no specific statements about the islands and who possesses them, other than that British sailors would retain rights to land and build huts on such islands, a right they would continually exercise for decades, which precludes another nation making an exclusive sovereignty claim. The important thing to remember about treaties and agreements is that they are ratified between two specific parties, and things change when those parties no longer hold sufficient authority. And change is coming to the political picture of South America in the next century. Like all empires, that of Spain has a limited lifespan, and its 11th hour is fast approaching. Others are waiting in the wings to strengthen their own colonial ambitions. For now, the islands would remain a Spanish colony and a stopping-off point for pliers of Antarctic trades until the first decade of the 19th century, when it will begin its descent into a frozen Tortuga of interest only to the latter. It is here at the dawn of the new century that we leave our story for now. Join me next time for Part 2, where we will present the largely unknown yet pivotal American involvement in the island's history, yet another Frenchman's attempt to make Port Louis work, the formal colonization of the islands by Britain, and the first seeds of Argentine nationalist revisionism. Fair winds and following seas, fraglets.